So let me dim up the lights here, and let's take a look at part 3 of translation. Okay, when I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I chose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. Okay, so we just did a little demo on translation. Translation is definitely a tricky thing in language. Okay, as I finished part 2 and said, we talk about language as if there is only one, but there is estimated to be about 3,000 languages and a number that's rapidly shrinking. We all kind of have a special relationship with our native language. Okay, we kind of think that that's our language and that it sort of belongs to us and it fits us the best. Especially those of you that speak multiple languages and English isn't your first language. June, English isn't your first language, right? Yeah, so you kind of have a sort of I would guess, a touching feeling for your native language, right? So according to a story from the United States, there was once a debate where a United States senator, and the United States is the best example of sort of people who really stick to one language. The U.S. Constitution should be amended so to state that English is the official language of the United States, and the senator stood up and said, if English was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for me. Think about that, okay? Okay? That shows sort of an ignorance of the world and the languages that are a part of it, right? So almost a kind of linguistic chauvinism, right? That you have a preference for your language over others, okay? When you learn a second language, and I can't put myself into that category, but I know that the second language helps you really understand the world in different ways and appreciate your own language in different ways. If words were just labels that we stuck on objects, like chair, right, or stool, then translation would be easy. You could just put the different label on there and it would be a piece of cake. But you know now that translation isn't that simple. It's not just changing the word into another word. A program like Google Translate would be easy to make because you would just look up a word in one language and the matching word in another language and just switch them. And it would be over. But it's not that simple, okay? There is more of an art to translation than a direct science, okay? It's not that simple. Language is not merely a reproducing instrument for voicing ideas, but rather is the shaper of ideas. We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. Okay, so let's take a look at why translation can be such a problem. Okay, I'm going to identify 3 main areas that cause this problem. Okay, the first is context. The context matters. Okay, so for example, to understand what the word chat means in English, you kind of have to know what other words that are related to chat are, like gossip and talk and discuss. So when someone first learns English and they hear the word chat, they need a context to place that in. It's because they don't really kind of grasp what's going on there with the word chat unless they already have a context to place it within. Okay? And each of those words, talk, gossip, and discuss, might also have different meanings. So there's a very subtle difference in when you translate the word chat into a different language. The next one would be untranslatable words. Every language has these. They have words that are just within that language. In English, it's the word quaint. There is no translation for the word quaint in most other languages. So when you describe quaint to someone who's learning English, you have to often bring in other words. And here's some words from other languages. Anyone want to try this one in German? Anyone? Come on. Someone want to give it a whirl? You got to say it loud and angry because you're German, right? Right? So that's kind of an important thing. So actually, let me, just one sec. I'm just going to... Okay, so as I was saying, this word in German means an improvement that actually makes things worse. We don't have an English word that kind of matches that. I mean, we can describe it in lots of words, but we don't have one word that kind of captures that. This word in Japanese, the feeling engendered by imperial beauty. This word in Indonesian, the relationship among a group of people committed to completing a task of mutual benefit. This word, which by the way was corrected, Inuit is not a language, Inuit is the name of the culture, essentially means he does not know which way to turn because of the many seals he's come to see that have come to the ice surface. So when you feed that into a translator, it doesn't have a matching word, right? It doesn't have a matching word in the other language, so that presents a problem. It has to then use maybe multiple words to explain it, and then when that's translated, you lose something maybe in the translation. The third problem with translation is idioms, right? These are colloquial expressions whose meaning can't be worked out just from the definition. For example, don't beat around the bush. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. They don't translate to their meaning, right? It is, out of sight. Okay, so here's an example. The words out of sight, out of mind was translated to Russian and then back to English, and it came back as invisible idiot. In a more practical example, Pepsi ran an ad called Come Alive with Pepsi in China. But when it was translated back, it said, Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. Because you're not capturing what the actual expression is, you're just maybe doing a direct translation. So I think the Chinese got it right. That's what they were essentially saying, but that's not what they meant in the ad, right? So those idioms are really hard to sort of get a translation accurate with, okay? Language was the real innovation in our biological evolution. Everything since has made our words travel faster or last longer. Okay, so clearly when we translate, things can get lost, okay? Most linguists would actually say there is no such thing as a perfect translation. You cannot do it. Something is always lost when you move from one language to another, okay? The Italian actually have a saying for that. Trattadore, I can't say it. The translator is a traitor. That's their expression for it, because we kind of all recognize that. But what makes a good translation? I'm going to identify three things. Faithfulness, okay? That the translation should be faithful to the original text. You shouldn't be radically changing it. Comprehensibility, that when it's been translated, it makes sense. It's comprehensible in what's coming out at the other end. And back translation, which is what we did this morning. When you go back to the original language, it should be very close to the original language. If you can do all three of these, you've got a good translation happening. The problem is, one of them often causes the other one to falter, right? So sometimes when you are faithful to translating, you lose some comprehensibility, or if you make sure that it translates back properly, it's not necessarily the faithful to the original text. Okay, the literal translation of Guten Tag in German, the literal translation is good day. Guten Tag, good day. But it's more often translated when translated as good morning or good afternoon, even though it really means good day, okay? For example, in French, s'il vous plaît, which I can't say properly, you guys are going to crush me on my French here, if it pleases you, is mostly translated as just please. When the literal translation, if it pleases you, is more accurate to the translation. So do you stick with the accuracy of the translation, or do you stick with the comprehensibility? Kind of have to give one up to make the other one better, okay? The closer you are to the literal translation, the more likely it is that you may sort of lose a little bit there. Now what about poetry? Poetry relies on things like rhyming devices and things like that. Now when you translate it to another language, you lose that completely, possibly, okay? So who knows if that's going to be an accurate representation, okay? It could be said as well, this is a big philosophical point, that all language has an element of translation in it. Even if you speak the same language, there's an element of translation in all forms of communication. Okay? So when you get to know someone, you are essentially getting to know their language, and you are translating what they're saying to you through that person. So translation could go in a bigger context as well. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. Okay? Some TOK teachers actually feel that this unit in language is the most important way of knowing. By far, they say. It's all about language. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't discount its importance as a way of knowing. But compare it to other ones like reason And sense perception, which we just did, I don't know. I don't know if it weighs that way. Okay, we're going to wrap this one today with labels and stereotypes. So we've concluded that we can't take words for granted in language. Okay, we now want to take a look at how that affects the world around us, right? So let's look at two things, proper names and general words, okay? We give proper names to people and places and pets, but the vast majority of words that we use just do not describe one thing. Like when we talk about like Mr. Weiss, that's one thing we're describing. But most words describe more than just one thing, okay? So essentially, language is a series of labels we're placing on things, right? Classroom, light switch. So if I label this light switch, yeah, it's a label that applies, but it isn't necessarily just applying to that one light switch. It's applying to lots of different ones, right? And so those labels get a little bit sort of vague. Now, there are some advantages to labeling things, okay? It's efficient. Rather than always, when you guys talk, go, Mr. Walks, can you please go over and turn off the light switch in room B5 of Sturgeon Heights Collegiate, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is maybe more accurate? You just say, Mr. Walks, can you go turn off the light switch? It's a little more efficient. It's a little more economical. If we had no word for sand and we were standing on a beach, we don't want to name every grain of sand. We just want to call it sand, okay? It's a little more economical. We can use labels to predict things, right? So if you look at a box and it's called apples on the outside of the box, it'll give you a general idea what's inside that box. It helps with your predictive sort of abilities, okay? The problem with labels is the mislabeling, right? If we can't label things as well, how do we classify things, right? How do we kind of put labels on things that are very sort of esoteric? Now, another view might say that labels are in fact social constructs, that we impose labels on the world, right? That labels are things we create, and they're not natural to us, that we are creating the labels, okay? So some might say, no, labels are natural. These things are apples, and we are just discovering that that label exists. And others are saying, no, you are imposing that label on that object, okay? Kind of a philosophical thing there. But some might even say that labels are cultural, and that your label is in the eye of the beholder, very much like our perception was in our previous unit. Okay, so kind of taking this to the next step, do labels passively describe reality, or are they actively structuring reality? So here's sort of a thing. If we see a group of something there, are we using the labels to just describe what we see? Or by using the label, are we creating that group? Kind of a tricky philosophical point there. Okay, another problem with labels is the idea of stereotyping, right? When you put a label on something, a bunch of assumptions then go with it, right? If you put a label on, for example, Mario is Italian, so he must like spaghetti and wine. And Franz is German, so he must like beer and sausages. You are using the label and bringing with it assumptions. Those assumptions could be called stereotypes, and at an even more sort of level, they could even be called prejudice, right? Depending on how you use the stereotype, okay? The thing is, stereotyping has an element of truth to it, okay? If you can say, like, all teachers are good at talking, that's a stereotype. But there's an element maybe of truth in that, right? There's a little bit of truth built into that. Stereotypes are typically what are called caricatures, right? They exaggerate the features of a group, okay? They're not always 100% accurate, but they do give you some predictive power. But the fault in that is people who then take that caricature, they take that stereotype, and they extend negative attributes with it. They extend them beyond their reasonable sort of things. Okay, so this could lead to things like prejudices, right? So for example, you could say, all old people are bad drivers, right? And now you see an old person driving, you're going to apply those things to that character. Are you being stereotypical, or are you being prejudiced, right? It depends on the level at which you're using that label. When you try to describe one of your friends to someone who doesn't know your friend, it's tricky, right? It's hard to verbally describe them with words that fit their character. You are going to put labels, like actual sticky labels all over this person that no one's never met before. What labels are you going to choose? You're going to think about what sort of prejudices or possible stereotypes could come with them. So if you say the word beautiful and you label that person that way, or you say the word average, what kind of stereotypes do you feel are coming up with that, right? So reality seems to be more than the language that we have available to us. Even when we use more and more language, it still never seems like enough to describe accurately what's actually happening there, okay? So it sort of, kind of definitely summarizes some of the faults of language.